what we achieved already, what the president achieved ending that war already was something no one thought was possible. Everyone thought that the last episode was going to be an Israeli incursion into Gaza City that would lead to massive loss of life and the hostages would never be reunited with their families. And today, as we speak, all the hostages that were living are back, all but I believe one of the bodies has been returned. No one would have believed that 6 months ago. So that in and of itself, but that is not the end of the story. We want to continue on this. But what we're talking about is dealing with something that no one has been able to solve in 30 or 40 years. No one. And it's going to take some time. But I feel generally optimistic that we have the right people at the table with the right motivations to make it happen. But no one is claiming to you that this is going to be just a straight up trajectory. It's going to have its ups and downs. It's going to have its good days and bad days. The important point is that the momentum and the trajectory on it is a positive trajectory, and we're investing.
Listen to the sound of your own complicity echoing through this chamber of horrors, because what we just witnessed is not political commentary. It's the linguistic equivalent of sanitizing genocide with a smile and a handshake. And Marco Rubio just gave us a masterclass in how American power structures manufacture consent for mass death by dressing carnage in the language of diplomatic progress, while over 70,000 Palestinian bodies pile up like forgotten statistics in the rubble of what was once their homes. The Palestinian Health Ministry reported that Israel's war on Gaza has killed at least 70,667 people since 7 October 2023, with women and children making up the majority of the dead. But Rubio stands there in his tailored suit congratulating himself on ending the war and achieving what no one thought was possible, as though the return of hostages somehow balances the scales of apocalyptic destruction unleashed upon an entire population trapped in an open-air prison with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide while American bombs paid for with your tax dollars rain down from the sky. This is what empire sounds like when it celebrates itself, and you need to understand the sheer audacity of what just happened in that clip, because Rubio didn't just lie. He performed a rhetorical sleight of hand, so brazen it would make Orwell's Ministry of Truth blush with envy, taking a ceasefire that exists primarily on paper and in press releases, while within the first 10 days Israel killed at least 97 Palestinians and wounded 230, violating the ceasefire 80 times, and somehow transmuting this ongoing slaughter into a narrative of American diplomatic triumph that positions Washington as the benevolent peacemaker rather than the weapons supplier and political shield that made this genocide possible in the first place. The man literally stood there and said all the hostages that were living are back with the self-satisfied tone of someone who just pulled off a miracle. Since the ceasefire began on October 13th, Hamas has freed 20 living hostages and transferred the remains of 22 deceased hostages, conveniently erasing from the frame the fact that Gaza has become what UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called a graveyard for children, where the number of injured is greater than 100,000, and Gaza has the most amputated children per capita in the world. But wait, there's more bombshell evidence of this moral bankruptcy that should make your blood boil, because while Rubio celebrates his positive trajectory and talks about having the right people at the table with the right motivations, the actual lived reality on the ground tells a story so horrifying that it defies the sanitized language of diplomatic doublespeak. As of August 2025, Integrated Food Security Phase Classification projections show 100% of the population are experiencing high levels of acute food insecurity, and 32% are projected to face Phase 5 catastrophic levels, with famine taking place in the Gaza Governorate, which includes Gaza City, Kuldal, and Awaris. And this isn't some abstract humanitarian concern we're discussing over coffee. This is systematic starvation as a weapon of war. This is the deliberate creation of conditions designed to make human life impossible. The UN Commission of Inquiry found that Israel blocked and obstructed trusted aid agencies, including UNRWA, from bringing in essential and life-saving aid, for the purposes of bringing about the physical destruction of the Palestinians in Gaza, through unlivable conditions of life in the Gaza Strip. The intellectual dishonesty embedded in Rubio's framing reveals everything you need to know about how American foreign policy operates in the 21st century, because this isn't just spin, it's the construction of an alternative reality where words like success and achievement can be applied to a situation that has resulted in over 72,500 people killed, including 248 journalists and media workers, 120 academics, and over 224 humanitarian aid workers, and where scholars have estimated 80% of Palestinians killed are civilians. Think about the sheer cognitive dissonance required to stand in front of cameras and declare victory while Israel had caused unprecedented destruction in Gaza and made large parts uninhabitable, leveling entire cities and destroying hospitals, religious and cultural landmarks, educational facilities, agricultural land and cemetery, This isn't hyperbole or partisan exaggeration. These are documented facts from international organizations and UN agencies that have been screaming into the void while Western media dutifully transcribe State Department talking points as though they constitute journalism. And here's where the analysis gets even more damning, because what Rubio is selling isn't just a lie about the present, it's a framework for erasing the future accountability for this genocide by establishing a narrative whereby American intervention is positioned as the solution rather than the fundamental enabling force behind the catastrophe. Rubio expressed confidence the first stage of the Gaza ceasefire will be completed very soon, and said the disarmament of Hamas is critical for an enduring peace. But notice how this framing never asks the foundational question about what created Hamas in the first place, never interrogates the decades of occupation and siege and humiliation that produced the very violence American officials now position themselves as heroically resolving. The entire discourse operates within a deliberately constrained moral universe, where Israeli state violence is rendered invisible or justified through appeals to security, while Palestinian resistance, no matter how desperate or born from impossible circumstances, is forever categorized as terrorism that must be eliminated through overwhelming force and collective punishment. This is how empire manufactures legitimacy for its crimes, and we're watching it happen in real time as U.S. officials, including Trump's son-in-law and informal advisor Jared Kushner, have been pushing to get the Gaza plan implemented by setting up a board of peace that will oversee the territory after 2 years of war and create an international stabilization force that would police the area, which is just another way of saying that after systematically destroying Gaza's infrastructure, killing tens of thousands of its people, and rendering the territory virtually uninhabitable, American and Israeli power will now determine who governs the ruins and under what conditions, stripping Palestinians of any meaningful self-determination while calling it peace. The audacity of appointing yourself as the mediator and peacekeeper after providing the bombs that created the humanitarian catastrophe is such a perfect distillation of imperial logic that you almost have to admire its totalizing cynicism, except that real human beings are dying and suffering, while these political maneuvers play out in carpeted conference rooms where the smell of death doesn't quite reach. Let's talk about what ceasefire actually means in this context, because language matters enormously when power deploys it to obscure rather than illuminate truth. And what we're seeing is the weaponization of terminology to manufacture consent for ongoing atrocities, rebranded as peace processes. Amnesty International issued a statement that Israeli authorities are still committing genocide against Palestinians in the occupied Gaza Strip by continuing to deliberately inflict conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction. And according to UN data, Israel is only letting about 20% of the agreed-upon aid trucks into Gaza, which means that even the minimal humanitarian obligations supposedly guaranteed by this celebrated ceasefire are being systematically violated while Rubio congratulates himself on American diplomatic prowess. This is gaslighting on a geopolitical scale, where the very officials enabling genocide through weapons shipments and diplomatic cover then position themselves as humanitarian saviors. And the truly terrifying part is how effectively this narrative penetrates mainstream consciousness, because most Americans will never dig beneath the surface-level story about hostages returning and diplomacy succeeding to understand that what they're actually witnessing is the normalization of mass death as an acceptable outcome of American foreign policy. The historical parallels here should chill you to the bone, because what we're observing is the playbook that has been deployed repeatedly throughout the post-World War II era, whenever American power needs to sanitize its imperial projects through the language of humanitarian intervention, peace-building. Remember how Operation Iraqi Freedom was sold as liberation, while it resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths and the complete destabilization of an entire region. Remember how Afghanistan was framed as a just war against terrorism that somehow morphed into a 20-year occupation that achieved nothing except enriching defense contractors, while Afghan civilians paid the price. The pattern is so consistent, it's almost formulaic. American military and diplomatic power creates or enables a humanitarian catastrophe, then positions itself as the indispensable nation, uniquely qualified to resolve the crisis it helped generate, and finally declares victory while the bodies are still being counted, and the survivors are left to navigate the ruins of their demolished societies. Rubio's performance is just the latest iteration of this propaganda technique refined over decades of practice, and what makes it particularly insidious is how thoroughly it has colonized the acceptable boundaries of mainstream political discourse, so that even questioning the fundamental premise that American power is a benevolent force in the world marks you as radical or unrealistic or somehow insufficiently serious about foreign policy. But here's the bombshell that should absolutely enrage you, because while Rubio was performing his diplomatic theater, UNRWA has not been allowed to bring any humanitarian aid into Gaza, including medicines and medical supplies, for more than 5 months now since March 2025, and malnutrition screenings conducted by UNRWA show that acute malnutrition among children under 5 years of age has more than doubled from March to June. The agency has run out of nearly 60% of essential medicines, with no medicines for hypertension and no antibiotics for adults, because UNRWA has not been allowed to bring in any humanitarian aid, including medicines and medical supplies, for 4.5 months. Children are dying from preventable diseases, from malnutrition, from lack of basic medical care, and Rubio stands there talking about positive trajectories and generational commitments, as though these platitudes have any relationship whatsoever to the material reality of human suffering that American policy choices have directly created. This isn't some abstract academic debate about Middle East peace processes. This is state-sponsored mass murder happening in slow motion, while American officials deploy euphemistic language to avoid the moral accountability that should attach to their actions. And the fact that this can happen in full view of the international community with minimal consequences reveals the profound moral bankruptcy of the current world order, where might makes right, and American exceptionalism provides an inexhaustible get-out-of-jail-free card for crimes that would result in international tribunals, sanctions if committed by nations outside the charmed circle of Western power. And you need to understand how the mechanics of this propaganda operation work, because it's not just about what Rubio says, it's about what the entire media political ecosystem does with these statements once they're released into the discourse. The United States issued sanctions against International Criminal Court judges, including Gocha Lord Kipanidi of Georgia and Erdenebel Surin Damdin of Mongolia, with Secretary of State Rubio saying the judges have directly engaged in efforts by the ICC to investigate, arrest, detain, or prosecute Israeli nationals without Israel's consent, and faulting them for voting with the majority when the ICC rejected Israel's attempt to pause the war crimes probe. This is the same administration celebrating its peace deal, while simultaneously attacking the international legal institutions designed to hold states accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity, which tells you everything you need to know about the sincerity of American commitments to human rights and international law. The message is crystal clear: rules and norms apply to everyone except us and our allies, and anyone who dares suggest otherwise will face the full weight of American economic and political retaliation. And this kind of lawless imperial behavior gets normalized through precisely the kind of anodyne diplomatic language Rubio deploys, where strategic interests and complex negotiations serve as euphemisms for protecting war criminals from accountability. The class dimensions of this catastrophe demand our attention because while ordinary Palestinians suffer and die, while working families in America struggle with healthcare costs and housing insecurity and stagnant wages, the U.S. is Israel's ally and has supported its genocidal war in Gaza by continuing to supply the country with billions in military and economic aid, meaning that your tax dollars are being funneled into weapons systems that are used to bomb hospitals and schools and refugee camps, while you're told there's no money for universal health care or free college tuition or addressing the climate crisis. The priorities embedded in these policy choices reveal who actually matters in the calculus of American power, and it's certainly not the multiracial working class struggling to survive in an economy rigged for the benefit of billionaires and defense contractors and fossil fuel executives. Every bomb dropped on Gaza represents resources that could have been invested in social programs, in infrastructure, in education, in the kinds of transformative policies that would actually improve ordinary people's lives, but instead that wealth gets converted into death and destruction in service of maintaining American hegemony and protecting Israeli apartheid, and Rubio has the nerve to stand there and call this success while offering nothing but empty promises about momentum and positive trajectories that exist nowhere except in the imaginations of people whose material comfort insulates them from the consequences of their decisions. Think about what it means that Rubio can say with apparent sincerity that no one would have believed 6 months ago that hostages would be returned, and frame this as some unprecedented achievement, when the actual unprecedented achievement is the scale and systematic nature of the destruction inflicted upon Gaza's civilian population. Based on satellite imagery collected on 8 July 2025, widespread destruction across the Gaza Strip has generated more than 61 million tons of debris, which gives you some sense of the physical impossibility of reconstruction when entire neighborhoods have been pulverized into dust, when thousands of more dead bodies are thought to be under the rubble of destroyed buildings, and the number of injured is greater than 100,000, with Gaza having the most amputated children per capita in the world. How do you rebuild a society under those conditions? How do families who have lost everything, who have buried their children in mass graves, who have watched their entire world get systematically dismantled by one of the most technologically advanced militaries on Earth, how do they move forward when the very people responsible for their suffering now position themselves as architects of their future? The psychological violence of this dynamic is almost as devastating as the physical violence, because it denies Palestinians even the dignity of their own grief and rage by demanding they participate in a peace process designed and controlled by the very powers that enabled their destruction. And here's where we need to connect this to the broader pattern of American imperial management, because what's happening in Gaza isn't an aberration. It's the logical expression of a foreign policy framework that has consistently prioritized the maintenance of American hegemony and the protection of client states over human rights, international law, or basic moral decency. Rubio said President Trump has made it a priority for the U.S. to play the role of a mediator that brings about the avoidance of war or the ending of conflicts, but when asked how that squares with the looming possibility of military intervention in Venezuela, Rubio said wanting to pursue peace and secure peace does not necessarily come at the expense of your national interest, which is just a slightly more honest articulation of the underlying logic that American interests, meaning the interests of American capital and the military-industrial complex, will always take precedence over the lives and welfare of people in the global South. This is the framework that has justified coups and interventions and sanctions regimes and bombing campaigns across Latin America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa, wherever American power perceives a threat to its dominance. And the truly insidious part is how this gets packaged as democracy promotion, or humanitarian intervention, or counter-terrorism, when the actual consistent thread is the brutal enforcement of a global order structured to benefit American and Western capital at everyone else's expense. The propaganda value of Rubio's statement lies precisely in its ability to make the unthinkable seem normal, to take a situation that multiple international bodies and human rights organizations have characterized as genocide and reframe it as a diplomatic success story. And this is why media literacy and critical consciousness are so absolutely crucial right now, because if you're not actively interrogating the narratives produced by power, if you're passively consuming State Department press releases filtered through supposedly objective news coverage, then you're being programmed to accept the logic of empire as common sense. The ceasefire narrative was set firmly in place and successfully laid out an official playbook for establishment media to follow, helping news outlets put into the rearview mirror the 2 brutal years Israel spent annihilating Gaza, where the number of Palestinians killed and wounded reached over 240,000 in December 2025, which means that the entire architecture of mainstream discourse is structured to minimize and obscure American culpability for mass atrocities, to focus attention on easily digestible human interest stories about hostage releases, while systematically ignoring the context of occupation and siege that created the conditions for violence in the first place. Let me absolutely hammer this point home, because it's fundamental to understanding how power operates in the 21st century. The reason Rubio can make these statements without fear of serious political consequences is because the entire American political establishment, from Republican warmongers to centrist Democrats, who wring their hands about civilian casualties while voting to approve more weapons shipments, has collectively decided that Palestinian life is expendable in service of maintaining the special relationship with Israel and preserving American influence in the Middle East. There is no meaningful opposition party on this issue, no institutional check on executive power when it comes to enabling Israeli violence, no media ecosystem that will consistently challenge the fundamental premises of American Middle East policy, which means that the work of resistance falls to movements and activists and ordinary people who refuse to accept the normalization of genocide and who are willing to risk social opprobrium and professional consequences to speak truth about what's happening. This is why the protests matter, why BDS activism matters, why every act of solidarity and refusal and resistance to the official narrative matters, because without mass mobilization and organized opposition, power will simply continue doing what it has always done, crushing resistance, managing empire, and deploying language to make horror seem acceptable. The cynicism embedded in talking about a generational commitment, while since the ceasefire agreement announced on October 11th, Israeli attacks have killed at least 393 Palestinians, injured 1,074 others, and led to the recovery of 634 bodies from under the rubble, reveals the fundamental contempt that American officials have for the intelligence of the public they're supposedly serving. They think you won't look past the headlines, won't dig into the actual data about what's happening on the ground, won't connect the dots between American weapons and Palestinian deaths. And for much of the population, they're probably right, because the educational system and media environment have been so thoroughly captured by elite interests that critical thinking about foreign policy is treated as suspicious or radical, rather than as the baseline requirement for democratic citizenship. But you're here, you're engaged, you're refusing the easy comfort of propaganda, which means you have a responsibility to spread this analysis, to challenge the sanitized narratives, to make it impossible for people in your life to maintain the convenient fiction that America is a force for good in the world, when the evidence of our complicity in atrocity is overwhelming and undeniable. And we cannot let ourselves be distracted by the theatrical elements of the ceasefire announcement from the structural realities that will determine what happens next, because a U.S. plan approved by the UN Security Council hands oversight of humanitarian aid and Gaza's governance overall to a newly established Board of Peace, headed by U.S. President Donald Trump, but Israeli authorities have so far resisted relinquishing their grip on humanitarian efforts, and have continued to restrict the entry of aid and sideline established organizations, including by using new NGO registration rules to deny nearly all requests from established international NGOs to bring goods and personnel into Gaza. This is neocolonialism in its most naked form, the imposition of external governance structures on an occupied population that has been systematically stripped of agency and self-determination, and calling it a Board of Peace doesn't change the fundamental reality that what we're witnessing is the imperial management of a subjugated people by the very powers responsible for their subjugation. The Orwellian quality of the language is almost artistic in its inversion of meaning, where peace means continued occupation, where stabilization means military control, where humanitarian assistance becomes a tool of political leverage rather than a moral obligation. And all of this gets normalized through the kind of bland technocratic language Rubio deploys that strips away the violence and suffering and reduces human catastrophe to a problem of coordination and logistics. Rubio's claim that that is not the end of the story is perhaps the only honest thing he said, because you're damn right, this isn't the end. This is just the latest chapter in a long history of colonial violence and dispossession that stretches back decades and won't end until the fundamental structure of Israeli apartheid is dismantled and Palestinians are granted the full rights and dignity they deserve as human beings. But Rubio isn't talking about justice or liberation or any kind of genuine resolution. He's talking about managing the conflict, about maintaining a status quo that's fundamentally untenable and morally indefensible, while pretending that incremental adjustments and diplomatic processes will somehow address the core grievances that drive resistance in the first place. This is the logic that has failed repeatedly throughout history, the idea that you can bomb and starve and terrorize a population into submission and then expect them to gratefully accept whatever scraps of autonomy their oppressors deign to offer, and it never works, because human dignity isn't something that can be permanently crushed through violence. It always reasserts itself in resistance and refusal, and the insistence on justice no matter how long it takes or how much suffering is required to achieve it. So when you see Rubio's smug face celebrating this achievement, when you hear him talking about positive trajectories and generational commitments, understand that what you're witnessing is the face of empire, congratulating itself for successfully managing the optics of genocide while the substance continues unabated. Understand that every word he speaks is calibrated to obscure American culpability, to frame imperial violence as humanitarian intervention, to make the unacceptable seem inevitable, and understand that your job, our collective job as people committed to justice and human liberation, is to refuse this narrative with every fiber of our being, to name what's happening in Gaza as genocide, to demand accountability for war crimes, to build solidarity movements that make the continuation of these policies politically impossible, and to never accept the premise that Palestinian lives matter less than Israeli lives, or that American strategic interests justify mass death. The work ahead is difficult and the forces arrayed against justice are powerful. But history shows us that determined movements animated by moral clarity can challenge and ultimately defeat even the most entrenched systems of oppression. And that's the only trajectory that actually matters, not Rubio's fantasies of managed peace, but the trajectory toward liberation and dignity and justice for all people, regardless of nationality or religion or ethnicity. This is the fight of our time, and there's no neutral ground. You're either complicit in genocide, or you're actively resisting it, and that clip you just watched should make the choice absolutely crystal clear.